Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Pop Culture Warrior. I am your host, CQ, and I'm really excited because my guest today is a visionary storyteller whose impact on the world of gaming, film, and literature spans over 3 decades. He's best known for creating one of the most iconic video games of all time, a groundbreaking title that set new standards for storytelling and animation in the gaming industry and continues to influence game design even still today, 35 years after its release. His career is a testament to creativity and innovation, crossing mediums from video games to screenwriting and now even graphic novels. His work has been recognized not just for its entertainment value, but for the depth of its narratives and the emotional resonance it brings to audiences worldwide. Recently, he has ventured into exploring his own family history in a moving graphic memoir and is also set to release a modern retelling of one of literature's most enduring classics. We don't have nearly enough time to cover it all, but we're going to do the best we can with what we've got while we've got him. Please welcome to the show, everybody, Mr. the incredible Jordan Mechner, everybody. Yay! Raucous applause,
Hi, thanks for
raucous,
having me on the show.
wild raucous applause from the audience. They're going nuts for you right now. Thank you, Jordan, for being here, man. I'm super excited. I am a gamer for as long back as I can remember. Since I can remember moving my hands, I had a joystick and was playing video games. And obviously, I mean, the beloved Prince of Persia series, your brainchild, which it's crazy. I can't even imagine from your perspective that all these years later that it's still important. It's still culturally relevant. It's still considered one of like the top 100 games of all time. Like that must be wild for you. To tell us a bit about that.
Well, for sure, that's more than I could have hoped for in 1985 when I started making this game on the Apple II, that it would still even be playable, much less be remembered, so many years later.
Absolutely. So first and foremost, before we dive into all this really cool stuff I want to talk to you about, we always try to get to know our guests a little bit more. We try to get from the angle that we like. Are a military veteran affiliated pop culture podcast and live stream. So first, do you have or what is kind of your military connection? Family, friends, or just a big supporter?
So I'm from New York. I'm actually in New York right now. I live in France. I've been living overseas for the last 8 years, not for a military reason. I went there for a video game project. So I've been an American expat, and that's kind of what my the graphic novel you mentioned, Replay, is about. It's about an American moving to France, with his two kids. But there's actually a military background in the previous generation. I'm American. My dad was born in Vienna, Austria, in 1931. So he was 7 years old, at the time of the Nazi Anschluss, when he and his, parents became refugees and fled Europe through France, which was soon, invaded and occupied in World War II. So my dad spent from age 7 to 10 as a child refugee in occupied France with his young aunt, and that's, I tell his story in the graphic novel, but interwoven with my own because it's because of that you know, that adventure that ended happily. My dad and his parents, were able to be reunited and come to New York and, became American citizens, which is, so I'm American and New Yorker as a result. But I sort of did the reverse geographically by moving my kids across the Atlantic in the other direction 8 years ago, not to save our lives, but for a video game project under much better circumstances.
For
And
sure.
then my grandfather, my dad's father, who was a doctor in Vienna, at the time that the family was forced to flee, he had actually been a soldier in World War I on the losing side, on the Austro-Hungarian Empire's side, on the Russian front. So I grew up sort of hearing, my dad's stories and also my grandfather's stories about having been a soldier, in that terrible war, 1914 to 1918. So he had survived two world wars, and growing up in my peaceful childhood in which I was able to read Mad Magazine and you know make video games and learn to program, I kind of always saw that in the context of what the previous generation had survived.
Sure. Yeah, they went through it so that you didn't have to, so that you could live a better life. That's it's incredible. What an amazing connection. Obviously, like I said, we're a pop culture podcast. Obviously, you have a rich history in games, in literature, and in comics, and screenplays, and writing, and all this. What is it that today you geek out about the most? Right? Where's your geek flag flying these days?
I my first love as a kid was comics because, there were no video games yet, in the early 1970s. So it was really, I mean, there was pinball, the local bowling alley, but it wasn't until like 1978 that Space Invaders came along and video games really started to be fun. So when I was a kid, I was all about comics and especially Mad Magazine. The movie parodies and TV parodies. Like I read those before I was old enough to see the movies. That like The Godfather and A Clockwork Orange and Patton. I encountered those movies first in the 70s through the Mad Magazine satire. So I wanted to write and draw my own comic books. That was probably what I would have done if the Apple II computer hadn't come along when it did. And I then got obsessed with programming, making games, and so I made my first game, Karateka, and then, as you mentioned, Prince of Persia, first on an Apple II computer, in the 80s. These days, really, comics are. I've come back to comics,
Mm.
but also because the field has advanced, and in so many different ways in different countries. I live in France now. I mentioned that, and the European tradition of graphic novels and comics is so different from the American one. It was really only after moving to France that I started to read all of these just decades worth of incredible masters, Hugo Pratt, and Jacques Tardy, names that are less well known here.
Mm.
But for me, like the stories that are told in European comic books is such a wealth, that I'm really deeply immersed in that now.
Oh, that's awesome. I love a good full circle moment, right? Coming all the way back to it. Never gets old. Let's dive in a little bit. Again, there's so many things we can talk about. I am curious about replay, right? And this what is it called? Replay Memoir of an Uprooted Family. It's incredible. I was reviewing it and taking a look at it. I mean, it delves into your family's past, particularly obviously we talked about your father's immigration from Europe. What inspired you to turn such a deeply personal story into a graphic novel?
Yeah, well, it was an interesting moment, and I had just, I'd moved to France for a video game project, and I tell the story of that development, in replay in the book, which ended, a few years later, as many video game projects do, with morphing into something else and then getting canceled. So at that point, I was like, having just done this sort of, big team, you know, lots of people involved, like editorial input, and just like with a big movie, there's financing and marketing considerations, and it's I had a desire to do something that would be more intimate, where it would just sort of be in my hands creatively. And there's like writing and drawing a graphic novel for me. It's like coming back to the rhythm of game development of the early '80s, when it's just a kid with a computer, like at home. You just make the game at your own pace. There's no production timeline milestones to meet. It gives you complete creative freedom. And I had the idea of telling my family's story probably in the back of my mind for a long time. I mean, like as a child of refugees, I think because uh, they were able to bring so little with them. The few photos and letters that they had saved, from the 20th century in Europe. My grandfather actually spent the 3 years of his retirement, as he'd been a doctor in Brooklyn, and then in the '70s he spent 3 years making a family memoir, in which he told his whole story of his childhood in the early 1900s in Chernovitz, which is now in Ukraine, his experience in World War I, soldier, and then in the 1920s getting married, having kids, being a doctor in Vienna, and then the flight, the escape during World War II. So he had put all of that down in paper with like letters and photos, and he expressed the desire that his children and grandchildren would kind of continue the story, and tell the story of their own generation. So I think from childhood, I sort of had in my mind that, someday when I get old, I'll do a memoir. And, I didn't feel old yet, but I wanted to do it, first of all, because my parents, are still around and able to answer questions. My dad is 93 years old, and it was a great luxury to be able to, you know, pick up the phone and call him from France and ask him questions about his childhood adventures. And, he's sharp as a tack and remembered, uh, just amazing details, which I was then able to flesh out by doing historical research. And, on the cover of Replay, there's these three strips representing three timelines. The top one is my grandfather as a soldier in World War One. Then I've drawn my dad, with my grandfather escaping from Vienna on a train. And then in the bottom panel, that's me with my dad, with my first Apple II computer in Chappaqua, New York, where I grew up. So it's a train in all three panels, and that's kind of a theme of the book. But I thought that having just moved to France, I was never going to have a better opportunity to tackle a project like this. And also, I have the good luck that in Montpellier, where I live, I have friends who are European graphic novel artists, and really being friends with them and sharing, working space with them is like an ongoing masterclass in graphic novel storytelling. So having the benefit of that is like, if I don't do it now, I'm never going to do it. So it was in 2019, I really set everything else aside and just immersed myself in this project of writing and drawing Replay. And of course, to write and draw 320 pages, is there's a lot of research involved, and also it's like 1,500 individual illustrations. So it took 3 years from start to finish, and I really enjoyed that project. But it was, I think, the right time to do it, and now I'm so glad to be able to share it, with readers, with Prince of Persia video game fans who are, because it contains a kind of a behind the scenes of making games in the 80s and various game development adventures of making Prince of Persia, but interwoven with this
Right.
the family story, of the 20th century and World Wars One and Two.
That's incredible. And the theme of displacement and uprootedness, it's obviously central. It's a central part of this story. How do you go I'm trying to, I know you have the stories like we talked about. You have the stories from your past and your family, but like how do you sit down and then explore those kind of themes to shape and really put the perspective of this identity and this belonging all into one book? Like it just seems like such a massive undertaking to me.
Yeah, and it was a very different kind of project from anything I'd done before, because in the past I've always done fiction, even when it's historical fiction. Uh, I have the freedom to invent, the incidents of the book. I really felt constrained to stick to what was true. I didn't want to sort of do the Hollywood thing and invent a love story where there wasn't one, or make something, more dramatic. I just wanted to really respect, you know, what my dad and what my grandparents had told me, and just tell it as much as I could the way that, you know, I thought that it happened. So, first, I mean, the first step was to really just understand the story. And I used Post-its. I used three different colors worth of Post-its. There's you can sort of see on the back cover, three suitcases, and each one is a different color. So I used sepia for my dad's and grandparents' story, things that I had heard about, but I wasn't born yet, so I didn't experience them directly. I had to rely on research and newsreels and photographs to be able to draw like the scenes of battle in World War One, or the invasion of France in 1940. Blue I used for my own memories, like growing up in the 70s and 80s, making games on the Apple II computer. Although oddly enough, that required research too, because enough time has passed that when I my the office that I had at Broderbund in 1988 when I was making Prince of Persia, that plastic box that I kept the discs in, what did it look like? And what movie poster did I have on the wall? Amazingly, with the internet now, like you can find all that stuff.
Mm.
So I mean, I really love research. If you can't tell, I would continue the research phase forever. If I didn't, okay, I got it. At a certain point, I got to start drawing pages. So blue for the, for my memories, things that I remember, and then yellow for the present day frame story, which is me as an adult moving to France with my two teenage kids from Los Angeles to Montpellier. And so the advantage of the colors is that it lets the reader kind of keep track. And so like it can jump from one timeline to another through a flashback. In one panel, I've got my dad in the 90s telling me about something that happened in the 1940s, and then it changes color so the reader can follow it. So what I did to structure the story is sort of wrote the key incidents, the episodes that I thought would be most important uh, to each story on these post-its in chronological order, and I put them out on sheets of paper. And then I tried to find the moments when they sort of intersected and overlapped. And the rule that I gave myself was that all three had to stay chronological, because already interweaving three timelines, it requires the reader to pay attention, even with the colors helping. I thought if I started jumping around in time within each timeline, it would just become too chaotic and impossible to follow. So I stayed chronological, but I looked for the points of overlap. And I think it's that kind of resonance between generations that makes a story like this work. Um, One of my references and role models was the movie The Godfather Part 2. There's so many movies that combine the stories of two generations, and often for me, like as in the audience, I feel like they don't quite work. And the one thing about The Godfather Part 2 that's so brilliant is the way that it transitions between the story, the older Godfather as a young man, and then his son Michael, played by Al Pacino, grown up, going through sort of some of the same milestones and situations in his own life. So there's kind of a commentary that, like, with the birth of a child, marriage or problem in a marriage. These things kind of echo in the different timelines. So with my three strips of post-its, I tried to find those moments where, maybe it was like a train trip, you know, for example, like myself now with my daughter going up to Paris to visit, when my dad comes from New York and visits us in France, for the first time since we moved there in 2017, that was something that happened. So I put it in the book, and I combined that with my dad's being in Paris in 1939 with his aunt as they're trying to cross over uh, from the occupied zone to the unoccupied zone. They had to take the same train from the Gare de Lyon
Wow.
that my daughter and I took. So having us meet up in France and then sort of like having the stories uh,
Interwoven.
combine at
Yeah.
just that point, it creates a resonance because it's the same train station, it's the same train. So I looked for those kinds of, as a small example, but I looked for those points, inflection points throughout the three stories, and also with my grandfather in World War One, the military aspect, the fact of him being, him wanting to volunteer for the army, but being too young, and then being conscripted into the army. I combined that with my son being the same age, age 17, 18, and, what he's going through at that point with the move to France. So I looked for those kinds of points, and that kind of helped me structure the book. It was a very sort of an intricate little construction job, and for a lot of chapters, it took me a few tries, to get it right, to get that balance right.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's incredible. That's, yeah. I love the idea of we're walking on the same steps as as a previous generation, like this idea and going back and forth. That's incredible. I was stationed, when I was in the military, I was stationed in Italy, in Vicenza, and so got to explore Europe, and to know that you're walking on the same streets as as Napoleon might have walked on one day or in the past. And so it's incredible to get to share that. I'm curious, you're working on this book, and obviously this is years obviously in the making, but when you're talking about kind of the like what's the old saying, like, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. So I'm curious, as you're
Absolutely.
looking back at all these different fixed points in history and all these amazing things, how does that make you feel about today? Because given the current global political climate, immigration is an issue, people being displaced. I mean, talk about, like, I know this comes from years ago, but it's really on the pulse today. So
Yeah.
how has working on this really made you feel about kind of where the world is today?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you say, I mean, the book is called Replay. So in a way, that's an allusion to the way that the past kind of keeps coming back in different forms. There's another, uh, the quote from Santayana that you mentioned, those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Right.
We're living that now. And there's another quote, which I love. I don't know who said it. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
Like, that's good.
The When I was writing this book, this was, 2019 to 2022. As I was finishing it, Russia invaded Ukraine, and so I was finishing the book, with this news coming in every day, and the strange feeling of seeing, on the news, the cities that I'd just drawn on a map, because my grandfather in 1917, 1918 was, and this was, he was born in Chernovitz, which is now in Ukraine. Today it's called Chernivtsi. And the trains that he took, as a child for a summer vacation, and then he went back to those same areas as a soldier on the train to fight on the Russian front of World War I. Those same towns now were appearing on the news and were being bombarded, and civilians were fleeing. So that was, I mean, terrible to see, but also giving me the feeling that this book was important. That it's,
Mm.
uh, I think, and because I have, the luxury to be living, in a peaceful, safe place, but France is not so far from Ukraine, and Kiev is basically a European city where a couple of years before, could go there, my kids could go there, and now it's a war zone, and so many places in the world now, like, civilians are being bombarded and having to flee, becoming refugees, uh, and going through and risking all of that, you know dangerous journeys, because being at home, when your life is in danger and your kids are in danger, is worse. And as has always been the case in history, some politicians cynically take advantage of people's fears and the stress, and kind of demonize refugees and immigrants, as being people who are different from us and who are dangerous. So I think it's important to tell the stories, individual family stories, because statistics, when you say this many people, this many thousand people displaced, or, you know, every single one of those people is a person with parents and kids and a family. And when one person becomes a victim, that's a tragedy that has ripple effects, through their entire family and network of friends, and on into the future. And just so I think telling the story of one kid, one family, like, no matter what their nationality,
Mhm.
or religion, it's universal. I think the experience of being separated from your parents, of being displaced, of being in fear, having to move to a new country and learn a new language, it's like, wherever you come from, like, that experience, is similar. And
Yeah.
so I think, to read a book where you can identify with somebody else's experience, I think that helps us, I think, to empathize, with people all over, and I think we can all sort of see ourselves and our own families reflected in more ways. So, I mean, that's part of the reason that I love to read. I love to read books, especially memoirs, graphic novels, because it helps me to give a context for the experiences of peoples and places in the world that I've never been to, and by seeing that sort of shared humanity, it makes it, uh, it gives me a kind of like a way to relate to these things that otherwise, just seeing them on the news, it's hard to
Yeah.
engage
You
with.
get a wider world perspective. I think that's something I've talked to a lot of military veterans, and we're blessed in that because we serve with so many nationalities and so many different countries and travel and things, that we gain kind of this broader understanding that we're just a speck, on this kind of giant tapestry of humanity. Um, and I love everything you said, and I think too, not just I mean it's such a man with the immigration and the being torn from your home and having to travel, but even look at like the after effects of the hurricanes. People their lives destroyed, and they have to uproot, and it's like, if you were born and raised and lived in that area, now you have to start all over, and it's this idea of loss and starting over, and oh man, it's just it hits so hard, and I'm so glad you have this there that people can read and connect to, and hopefully gain a better understanding of, that we could, like you said, we live comfortably today, we live nicely today, but just a generation back, 2 generations back, they went through these unbelievable things that we need to remember. We need to see and appreciate and be glad that they came through it so that we can have these peaceful existences. So just really, oh man, I implore everybody to get a copy and to read the story. Before we run out of time, though, I do want to talk a little bit about Prince of Persia because obviously that's a huge part of your story and celebrating 35 years, 35th anniversary. Prince of Persia has evolved across multiple platforms. It's been in multiple versions of media over the past 35 years. I'm curious from your perspective, what's been the most surprising thing that you've learned from this kind of enduring legacy of this game?
Yeah, I think the thing that impresses me most now, in year 35 and counting, is just the incredible diversity of the community of players and teams, who've played Prince of Persia, worked on Prince of Persia, created Prince of Persia games over the years. I mean, as you probably know, this year, 2024, has been an amazing year for Prince of Persia. After a long quiet period, two new Prince of Persia games have been released. Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown from the Ubisoft Montpellier studio, which, if you read replay, that's the town in France that I moved to. So I know the guys who've made this wonderful Metroidvania 2D game, which is just a beautiful way to kind of relaunch Prince of Persia after so long, since the Sands of Time trilogy and the 2008 cell shaded game that were made in Montreal. All great and all different. So I think one of the challenges for the team making a new Prince of Persia game now in 2024 was to kind of acknowledge the fact that, depending on what Prince of Persia game you played and how, what generation of gamer you are, Prince of Persia could mean something totally different, whether it's the 2D Apple II or PC or Super Nintendo original game, or the Sands of Time trilogy. Uh, that, for many people, like, that was the first Prince of Persia game they played, and that's what Prince of Persia means to them. Or the 2010 Disney movie with Jake Gyllenhaal as the prince, or even the late 2008 cell shaded one with Elika has its own set of fans who, for them, that's so the Lost Crown kind of includes, in different ways, it sort of has all of that, finds its way into, the new reimagined Prince of Persia universe, but in a way that's also very, very coherent and absolutely its own thing, very deeply inspired by Persian mythology. So it's great to see, the franchise, flourishing again. And of course, there's the remake of Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, which, released 21 years ago this year, and a new young team in Ubisoft Montreal is working on that remake now. So that's going to be out in 2026. So it's great to see all of this, but at the same time, you've got a community of retro gamers who are, like, taking the Prince of Persia source code, which is online on GitHub for people, interested in digital archaeology, who want to see how games were programmed in 6502 assembly language back in the day. Like, that's there. People are modding it and creating their own new Prince of Persia levels and doing speed runs. So it's so many different aspects to this community, and it's just wonderful to see.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I remember my first moments. It might have been Prince of Persia 2, but I remember the side scrolling and hitting the switches and jumping and falling to my death 1,000 times and, like, oh man, that was, I mean, in all love, that was the most infuriating game I remember playing as a child. It was like that and like Oregon Trail, like it just would drive me nuts. But I was too young. But it's all great. If I'm curious, if you could go back in time, right, and give advice to your younger self when you were developing Prince of Persia, like looking back now, what advice would you give?
That's interesting that you say that, because going back in time is the theme, well, it's the theme of Replay, the graphic
Yeah.
novel, but it's also been the theme of the Prince of Persia games. I mean, even to the point of giving the player a dagger
Sands of
full of
Time.
magic sand.
Yeah.
Time, yeah. Uh, I think the advice I would give my younger self about game development is kind of the same advice that I would give in general, which is to treasure like the moments while they're happening. Because especially like we're driven, we're thinking, I'm going to do this and get this done, and then that's going to enable the next step. It's so easy to like live with, our eyes sort of fixed on the future, but to really just treasure the moments as they're happening because it goes by so fast. And especially to treasure the human aspects of these moments. I think often, especially in a professional context, we're you know with people on a team, we're trying to achieve an objective, and so we're focused on, how do we get this done? Is it going well? Is it going badly? And it's only like decades later that we look back and we realize that these people who were our comrades, that the relationships that we've formed with them are kind of the fabric of our lives. And so to just like even when we encounter someone in a difficult situation professionally where we see that person as an obstacle, like I'm trying to convince them of something and I just, you know, that happens, like you go through that situation, then you encounter the same person again in a different situation. So the context keeps changing, but that relationship stays. And so just I would give my younger self the advice to just be as aware as possible of the people that I'm encountering and who they are and what their stories are, and just to realize that our shared story, after a few decades, amounts to something important.
Mm. Oh, that's such good advice. We often get so obsessed with the outcome and everything will be better once I just do this, 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 and this, and you don't appreciate what you have in front of you and the ride. Man, I love that. That's so good. I'm gonna put you on the spot here a little bit. So obviously we talked about it. The Prince of Persia has been adapted into movies and graphic novels and reboots and all these different things. So, do you have a favorite caveat that you're not was it you weren't directly involved in? What's your favorite kind of adaptation or version of The Prince of Persia?
Okay, well, the ones that I wasn't directly involved in,
Yes.
which I mean, in a way, you've made it easy because like we love all our children, so to have to choose between the original Prince of Persia or
Right.
the Sands of Time, the ones that I would like, that I was in,
Yep.
would be hard. But The Lost Crown, since it just came out and, I played it recently and I had the experience of discovering it as a player. Since I wasn't part of the team for that one, I'm just so happy to have this game and really enjoying it. I think they did a beautiful job. So, The Lost Crown.
Okay, I love it. And finally, we'll move on to a different topic, but I gotta ask, as you kind of reflect back on 35 years with Prince of Persia, uh, from your perspective, what elements of the game do you think kind of contributed to why it was successful then, and also why is it cross generationally? Why is it appealed to continually to appeal to gamers?
Yeah. I think the deep source of Prince of Persia is something that goes back thousands of years, which is the tales of the Thousand One Nights, which come out of Persian Iranian culture, and they're sort of part of our collective, you know, cultural uh, unconscious. That is, as a kid, I can't even remember the first time I heard those stories. Maybe it was in a children's book, maybe it was in the Warner Brothers cartoon, Ali Baba Bunny, or Mad Magazine satires. Like there was this wonderful 1940 movie, Technicolor movie, The Thief of Baghdad. So all of that was sort of in my childhood, and so in 1985, choosing a subject, a setting for this platform running jumping game that I wanted to make, uh, it just kind of bubbled up, and I think I tapped into something that just runs so deep. That was a big part of the reason that Prince of Persia spoke to so many people. I mean, it worked with that sort of pixely, very simple graphics of the time, and then it worked with the newer generation of graphics with the PlayStation 2, with the Sands of Time. It worked as a movie in 2010, uh, and it's working now as a Metroidvania. I think it's the combination of something very ancient with something with new technology, and action adventure storytelling. I think it's just a combination that worked, and yeah, I have to thank kind of the magic of that pairing, for Prince of Persia's longevity.
Absolutely. And I mean, obviously not that we have you to thank for all the, but no, you know what? I take that back. We do have you to thank because I think of all the game franchises that have come and been created that had to have drawn inspiration from games like the Prince of Persia, like modern day Assassin's Creed. That's to me, that's just a really, really updated version of us of Prince of Persia. So, I mean, really, there's so much that came that was spawned off of that idea and that style of gameplay, and it just kind of evolved over time. I love it. I'm so grateful for it. Before we let you go, I do want to talk a little bit about your modern retelling of the Count of Monte Cristo. What again? I know we've kind of touched on it a little bit because you've talked about like the past and drawing inspiration. But what drew you specifically to the Count of Monte Cristo as a story that was worth reimagining in the modern era?
That's this one, yeah, and it's
Beautiful.
see, it's 220 pages. This one I wrote. I didn't draw it. I worked with the wonderful Italian illustrator Mario Alberti, and it was published first in France, and so now this is the English version from Magnetic Press. That's we did a Kickstarter for the English edition, and now it's going to be shipping this month. Yeah, I was on a train actually in Europe reading the original Alexandre Dumas novel, The Count of Monte Cristo, which takes place in 19th century France. It's about the Napoleonic era, but it just struck me reading it that the story he told of an innocent young man who's unjustly, accused of a crime he didn't commit, thrown into prison by his enemies who kind of conspired to use their position to get him out of the way. One of them so that he can marry his fiancée, uh, this beautiful young woman, his high school sweetheart, uh, who they're going to get married, and this other guy gets his rival out of the way. But then there's also a work colleague who gets rid of him for his own reasons, and then there's the prosecutor who, for to avoid a political scandal, conspires to like send this guy off to prison without a trial, and he spends 15 years in this secret prison only to come back through this extraordinary chain of events in a new identity, rich, powerful, and determined to use his fortune and all of the skills that he acquired uh, along the way to take revenge on these three people. So it's a wonderful story. It's worked, beloved by generations of readers, especially in France. But reading it, I was struck by how this reminded me of the period, the post 9/11 period that we had just lived through as a country here. As a New Yorker, I had, sort of watched this, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the way that so many people, starting, with soldiers and civilians, suffered because of the way that this, the great fear that we all had of, of Al Qaeda and, of another terrorist attack sort of served as a justification for things, some of which were uh, like the episode described in Monte Cristo, you know, innocent victims who kind of found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. So this is the modern version of the Count of Monte Cristo is the story of a young American uh, contractor who's working in Iraq in the post-war construction in 2005, who finds himself framed for terrorism and sent off to an offshore prison where he goes through a gauntlet and an adventure similar to what Dumas described, but it's the modern version. And then he comes back in the present day, returns to America in a new identity as a kind of a mysterious Eastern European billionaire. Nobody really knows where his money comes from, but the three people who got him out of the way have now risen to prominent positions in Wall Street, government, and politics. And they're very very highly placed targets, but our Monte Cristo is able to sort of insinuate his way into their lives in this kind of chess game to try to use his fortune and his intelligence to bring them all down. And so it's just Dumas created a wonderful structure. So to try to find the modern equivalent, and researching, the way that the FBI and the Justice Department and Wall Street and hedge funds all work today, to do a version that's as accurate about our modern day systems as Dumas was about his 19th century France portrayal. It was just, I mean, I love research. I approached this as if it were a historical novel, even though it's sort of my own time and place and the towns in New York and Connecticut that I grew up in, and Washington, D.C., and then also towns in Europe, because it's an international story. Uh, I love doing the research, and the illustrator, Mario, also is a demon for the details. And so it's funny because he was Italian, and I'd written the places that I know about, but he had never been, for example, to Stamford, Connecticut. So he was asking me for references, and so I was telling him, what movies to watch. I recommended that he watch The Town with Ben Affleck to see how people, dressed in Connecticut in 2004, in this kind of a neighborhood, and what kind of cars they would drive and so forth.
Wow. I I mean, man, that's such a good description. How do you because I mean, you really did nail it when you mentioned it, but how do you balance staying true to the original while in essence changing the elements, right? So that it resonates with that contemporary audience. I mean, how do you decide what stays and what goes and what gets changed, etc.?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I started with the approach that as much as possible, I wanted to use Dumas' story and characters, but the world has changed so much, and also because what he wrote was a 1,200-page serialized novel. I think it's not structured the way that you have to structure a book if you want it to be like like one tome, that delivers a punch. It has to kind of build to a climax. You want it to be as exciting as possible. You don't have the luxury of having episodes that kind of go off in a subplot that, that's not absolutely essential to the story. And probably the most challenging thing is the way that our attitudes towards, uh, well, for one thing, the female characters in Monte Cristo are like really play a subsidiary role. And I think, like there were opportunities there, like in telling the story today, you have like it wouldn't be right to do Monte Cristo without recognizing that we now live in a society in which women can occupy active positions in a way that in Dumas' 19th century conception, he just didn't think of that. Another example would be that the original Monte Cristo hinges on the idea of fighting a duel, for honor, that if someone insults you, you're obliged to risk your life in fighting a duel. That's no longer true today. So as much as possible, and especially in, I think, the last, the setup of the book, the first third is more similar to Dumas, and it's really in the last half where the story moves toward a resolution that I've had to find different modern equivalents. But there I tried to ask myself the question of, why did Dumas make this choice? He set up this chain of plot twists and so forth, which doesn't work because in today's society, like that, it just wouldn't happen like that. But in terms of character and emotion and surprise, like what are the key effects that he achieves? And so once I sort of had those, I would try to find a reason. Like, for example, a moment when Monte Cristo's old love comes to him and asks him for mercy, on behalf of her son, in a way that, in order to grant her request, Monte Cristo has to basically risk his entire project of vengeance and accept that he might be killed if he agrees, and he agrees. Like, so the details of what it is that he agrees to wouldn't work in the modern version, but I tried to find an equivalent to bring him to that same emotional place of having to make a choice. That's one example.
Oh,
But
that's perfect.
yeah. Well, one of the biggest differences in terms of the structure is that there's a very important female character in books 2 and 3 of the graphic novel, who doesn't exist in the Dumas original, and she's a young FBI agent, a millennial, who becomes suspicious of Monte Cristo and starts trying to lobby her boss to, the FBI director, to open an investigation. So because she's sure that he's up to, something nefarious, and she can't get the authorization for this investigation because the FBI has other priorities than investigating someone who has not yet committed a crime.
Right.
But so she becomes an important character, and also she and Monte Cristo develop this kind of rapport because he sees that she's like an honest person who's smart and who's onto him, and he enjoys that. He respects it,
Mm.
but at the same time, he's also determined to win. So it's almost like a Thomas Crown affair, kind of cat and mouse relationship between the two of them, which actually weaves in really well with the other events that Dumas had come up with. He just, you know, he did it differently, but in the graphic novel, having this character really enabled me to build the second half, and especially the third book of the trilogy, into to really come to a dynamic and exciting uh, conclusion.
No, that makes perfect sense. Um, I'm curious because you have tackled such complex narratives in the games, in the books, everything. Uh, what's your approach to kind of keeping these stories engaging across different formats and kind of just for different audiences?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a great privilege to work in so many storytelling mediums that I love, that I've loved since I was a kid. I mean, comics, graphic novels, video games, and then screenwriting and film are all storytelling media, but they work so differently. I think each one really required I would say at least a 5-year apprenticeship of kind of getting up to speed to the point where like I felt like I understood the medium enough that I was starting to to unlock its potential a bit. I mean, in games, probably the most important thing is that the storytelling should be interactive. So to take the example of Prince of Persia: Sands of Time. I mean, this was 20 years ago, but I think it still holds true that when the most dramatic moments of the story are experienced by the player in gameplay, they hit harder than if you just sit back and you watch that happen in a cinematic and then you start playing again. Things like having the like when the princess Farah steals the dagger of time from the prince, for good reasons of her own, but then as the player, suddenly you don't have the dagger anymore and you have to go through this incredibly dangerous sequence without the ability to rewind. You feel that in a way that even watching a movie, like with the empathy that you feel for the character, it's greater when you have to experience that yourself. So as much as possible, giving those storytelling moments to the player, putting them in gameplay rather than in cinematics. Movies, adapting Sands of Time from a game story to a film story. I mean, I was the first screenwriter on the movie. There were 4 writers who came after me. So if you've seen the movie, there's plenty in there that doesn't reflect my intentions, but the basic structure of making it a kind of a road trip across Persia, uh, what was, that's the way I conceived the story. Whereas the story for the Sands of Time game was deliberately contained in one palace, uh, in the course of like one day and night. And there it's just, again, the matter of like what each medium does best. When you're doing especially a Disney Jerry Bruckheimer movie with a cast of thousands, and you're going to go to Morocco and film there, and you can have, you know, casts of, thousands of people and soldiers and horses and camels. It's like, you want that, and you want the colorful supporting characters. You want that tapestry of, of a journey. But for the game, because the gameplay consisted of, sort of acrobatic, parkour, combat, uh, being able to do wall runs and basically get from point A to point B in a very satisfying and challenging way. Like that works best in a contained environment. Having crowds of people and secondary characters on a PlayStation 2, at that point we couldn't do that. Having just 3 characters on the screen was plenty. And so that's why the plague and Sands of Time that transformed all the characters into sand monsters, except for the player and the NPC sidekick and the villain, made sense because that means that everybody you meet is a combat opportunity, because there's no button on the PlayStation 2 controller for meet somebody and have a conversation with
Yeah.
them. Yeah, graphic novels, again, a third storytelling medium, very different from games and movies because you don't have that timing element. When you edit a movie, timing is everything. But with a book, it's up to the reader to establish the timing, turning the pages. The reader decides when to turn the page, and you can invite the reader's eye to travel over the page in a particular direction at a particular pace. But some people read faster, some read slower. So you can turn back the pages. So it's really almost interactive in a different way. You're giving the reader the power to tell the story to themselves in their own way.
Hmm.
And it's what happens often between the panels that takes place in the reader's imagination carries as much meaning as what you've actually drawn.
That's right. Oh man, that's perfect. And I think you touched on something really good. I'm curious what your, again, being that you've been in this kind of realm for so long, with the evolution of technology in gaming, in storytelling, right? We've seen VR, we've seen interactive experiences and, click through adventures and all these different things, 4D and all these things happening. How do you see the future of narrative driven games and other media evolving over time?
Yeah, well, and the future of games and interactive narrative isn't just one thing at this point. It's because we have so many different formats and technologies making so many things possible. We can have these huge open world games with teams of hundreds of people at the same time as we have indie games that are experiences created by a team of two people.
Hmm.
And of course, VR is another thing. Mobile and handheld is another thing. Games with a social component where you're interacting with other people online. So all of these things, it's like this is now the palette from which game creators and narrative creators can draw on. So, I mean, the future is certainly very rich, and we're going to see things in the next years and decades that maybe we wouldn't even consider today as games, but which still have that element of storytelling and of interactivity.
Absolutely. And as we wrap this up, I'm curious, uh, what advice would you give someone who is maybe, they have that nugget, they have the idea of the story, of the journey, but they're not sure where to get started, right? What medium to approach it from? What advice would you give to those new kind of creators?
I think the best way to start is to use what you have at hand. I mean, because having an idea for a grandiose project that maybe it'll be 5 or 10 or 20 years before we actually are in a position to make that real, that's great. File that away somewhere and ask, like, what can I create right now? What can I, whether it's programming a game or drawing a comic strip or writing a story or doing a podcast. If whatever we have the ability to create and that we can share with people, like, to work in that form is a step which can bring us to the next step and the next step, and over years and decades, like, it's amazing where that can lead us. But as long as you're moving forward, that gives us the chance to steer and to change direction.
Oh, that's wonderful. All right, I'll give you the last few seconds here. If you have a social media, let's plug that. Tell the viewers one last time, where can they support you? How can they support you? Where to find all the projects you're involved in, and why they should go ahead and get that.
I, well, thanks. I hope you'll read my graphic novels. And I have a website, jordanmechner.com, which is free, and it's a repository of archival behind the scenes materials about the making of my games all the way back to the 80s. So if you're into Prince of Persia or The Last Express, I've posted things like scripts and design documents and links, for all of that. That's also where I post the news about my new projects, announcements about the latest Ubisoft Prince of Persia games, and my new graphic novels, Monte Cristo and Replay, as well as upcoming projects. The website is where I announce it first, jordanmechner.com. And I'm
Awesome.
on social media as well. All my links are at the bottom of the landing page of that website.
Perfect. Yeah, and we'll link everything to in the comments or in the description of this video. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us today. Man, there are few people you get to really meet that have left kind of an indelible mark, a fingerprint on an industry the way you have across multiple facets of industries and media, and truly an honor to get to speak with you. I really appreciate your time, and I can't wait for people to go check out your stuff, and I can't wait to see what you come out with next.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. All right, guys, we're gonna toss it to a break, and when we come back, we'll have more show. But I just want to give a big thanks to Jordan Mechner, everybody. Big round of applause. Thanks for coming on, man.